Hello, and welcome back to our series of studies on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. This is a series of studies that began at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Cheyenne, Wyoming in October of 2010. And we did not get through the entire book, and hopefully we'll pick it up again at St. Paul's this fall, September, or probably October again. September is pretty busy, but if we have time, we'll pick it up in October, I believe. It's based on the book I wrote on the 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, Night of Infinite Resignation. And this book may be purchased on Amazon.com. You just go to Amazon.com and put in my name, Ross M. Bagne, B-A-G-N-E. When we were doing the study at St. Paul's, some of the members and some people who read or who bought the book advised me that it might be good to get into a deeper explanation of what SK is all about, because the book really only touches the surface of his aesthetic and philosophical writings, and so a deeper explanation and a study needs to be done on the book to really get a fairly good appreciation of what SK was all about. So we're going to start up on page 98, and we're going to get now into Stages on Life's Way. And this is a big book. I can pick it up here in my typically messy office. Here, this is actually, when I first got this book, it was out of print. So I had to go over to the University of Wyoming and get a copy of the book on a copying machine. I believe now the book is back in publication again. So, but it's a very lengthy book, and it takes a lot of effort, as most of SK's writings do, to really appreciate them. And the deeper you dig, the more you're going to get out of it. And I often say that SK is not an author that you learn. SK is an author you absorb. It's like learning a foreign language in a way. It's like when I was learning Latin, I had that same sort of feeling that I had to absorb it and not just learn it. And and like with any great thinker, like let's say Shakespeare, writer, poet, whatever you want to call him, SK takes time, and the more time you put into it, the more energy and intellect you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. But it is an esoteric topic, and there's not a lot of people who really get into it. But for those who do, I wanted to put this on YouTube. Now, Stages on Life's Way is really a repetition of Either Or Volumes 1 and 2, which we've already discussed. And I misstated that Stages is a repetition of Either Or Volume 2. It's actually a repetition of Either Or Volumes 1 and 2. So I just wanted to correct that. I just noticed that. And it's funny how these little editorial errors sneak in, and you think you got the book all edited down right, and suddenly something pops up that you didn't anticipate, or you didn't recognize before. Stages on Life's Way is maybe the least underappreciated of all of SK's aesthetic and philosophical writings. And this was something that SK himself predicted. He predicted that the book would never become widely popular because of its very, very in-depth nature. But parts of it definitely did. And it's considered a work, many parts of it are considered a work of genius. And the book starts off, once again, as with in Either Or Volume 1, it starts off with an analysis of the aesthetic sphere. And in our prior lessons, we got into how SK really defined the aesthetic sphere of existence. So this is a repetition. Kierkegaard loved repetitions. He said the most talented authors could take one subject and write on the same subject over and over again, and each time see something new, something different in each study. So he loved these repetitions, and Stages is an example of that. It starts off with a essay or story, whatever you want to call it, on the nature of love between a man and a woman. And it really brings us deeper into what I think in our day and age has been lost on modern society, and how unique love is, and how unique a happy marriage really is, because it requires this true love that only God can give. And unfortunately, too many people get married to people they don't truly love. So it's a good, the whole thing is a good analysis of the nature of love between a man and a woman, and what it really signifies. And so much of it has been lost, especially in light of the sexual revolution of the 20th, last part of the 20th century, which has done so much damage to love and marriage. So it's well worth reading. And anybody who wants to understand more about what marriage is should definitely read it, especially when we get into the writings of Judge William, which will come later on. We've already met Judge William in Either Or Volume 2. Georg Brandes, the Danish author, called this work that begins the book, called In Vino Veritas, a work of genius. And it really is. It rates right up there with some of the greatest works in prose. And as I said, Stages is a repetition. In this chapter, In Vino Veritas, we're going to look into five different points of view of what love is between a man and a woman in the aesthetic sphere. And these 5 points of view are represented by 5 characters. And I'll mention those in just a second. But I wanted to mention, and the word In Vino Veritas means roughly, and my Latin is not all that great, means in wine is truth, or wine is in the, truth is in the wine, so to speak. And that is when the participant is intoxicated or nearly intoxicated, because we loosen up when we're a little tipsy, not drunk, but when we've had a few and relax. And so it fits perfectly into the mindset of these characters who were not yet in the ethical sphere. And drinking was a big part of their lives in many cases. He first starts on this wonderful observation about what it means to write in a great style. And this is this is something every serious author should study or think about or contemplate on, and that is the difference between recollection and memory. And there is a big difference between recollection and memory. And the more recollection a writer has, the better he will write. Memory is one thing, you can put things down in order, but recollection requires a deeper poetic insight that pure memory just doesn't have. The pseudonym who wrote this book is unnamed, and later SK comes to name him the IMI, or the third person in writing. And SK usually eschewed the third person, but in this story he writes in the third person. I think it's the only time he ever wrote a story in the third person. He always much preferred the first person, because the first person has more immediacy. But here's what he says, this author, this IMI. Recollection is not by any means identical with remembrance. Thus, one can remember an occurrence with precision without recollecting it. Memory is merely a minimal condition. By means of memory, the experience presents itself to receive the consecration of recollection. The distinction is discernible and the difference so easily observed between youth and old age. The old man loses his memory generally. It is the first faculty that is lost. Yet the old man has a poetic quality. In the estimation of primitive peoples, he is prophetic, God-inspired. But recollection, indeed, is his best faculty, his consolation which consoles him with poetic farsight. On the other hand, childhood has memory and retentive apprehension in a high degree with no recollection whatsoever. So here's a profound, for me anyway, a profound insight into a difference between the style of great writers and sometimes just merely competent writers, and that is this power to reflect, this power to work things over in one's mind and have a great reflective insight into what actually happened. And if I think of writers who I believe had that, Shakespeare comes to mind, of course, first and foremost, this power of recollection, of seeing not just the memory of what happened, but why it happened and the underlying existential principles of why it happened. Other writers, there are many, too many to mention. Robert Louis Stevenson, I think, comes to mind. Guy de Maupassant, Somerset Maugham, Leo Tolstoy. This inner prophetic insight into things. It's this unique gift that great writers have, and you can't teach it. It's something that you have or you don't have, and that's why you can't teach great writing. It requires this mental ability, and if one has it, then it empowers him to be a great writer if he can harness it and express it in the right way. So the whole subject of In Vino Veritas concerns actually a banquet in which there were 5 people invited. The 5 people were Constantine Constantius, and then the 4 guests. Constantine Constantius is actually the one who sets up the banquet, so there's 5 people and 4 guests. To this banquet, 4 guests besides Constantine were invited. The names of these persons and the order in which they gave speeches were as follows: the young man, Constantine Constantius; Victor Arametta, the lady's tailor, and Johannes the seducer. The subject of the banquet is to talk about love between a man and a woman. For S.K., the greatest of all of life's revelations outside of religion have to do with the relationship between man and woman. So all speeches at the banquet were to be given in vino veritas on this subject. And the people in the banquet are patterned, in my opinion, after this intellectual society that S.K. often attended in Copenhagen with intellectuals and other writers at the time. The young man is the first to analyze this subject of the love between man and woman. And he starts out by saying this: I will assume that the erotic has its potency in the relationship between the masculine and feminine. What then? If the lover were to say to his Lélage, I love thee because thou art a woman, I could just as well love every other woman, just as well as love the ugly Zoe. If I did, the beautiful Lélage would be insulted. What then is the lovable? That is my question. But the fatality is that no one has been able to tell me. The individual lover stoutly believes, for his part, that he knows the answer, but to another man he is not able to make himself intelligible. And he who listens to the talk of several lovers will ascertain that no two of them say the same thing. I need say nothing of the perfectly foolish explanations which end by letting a man run his nose against the door. That is to say, end by saying that it is a sweetheart's pretty face or pretty feet or the beloved man's much admired mustache, which properly is love's object. But even then, even when one hears a lover talk in this lofty style, he hears him first recount several particulars, but finally he gives up and says her whole lovable nature. And I think so many men have this experience with women who feel perhaps insecure in why the man loves the woman and asks, what is it about me? What I even had a girlfriend who asked me what physical part of her body that I liked the most. And I couldn't answer, and I finally says, I don't know. It's just the whole package, you know. And see, that's what you come up with when you finally try to describe what it is that makes a person love another person. And it's a God-given gift. And there's often this expression that a marriage made in heaven. And really, all true happy marriages are made in heaven. And if they're not, then they can never be fully happy. I mean, you can develop into a tolerable relationship, but there's not the God-given gift there of a true love that it really binds it together. And even then, people don't always choose the one that they truly love, and it's a great tragedy. And it's sometimes hard to recognize that. And SK goes into a lot of analysis of how to recognize what is true love and what isn't. And I think we'll be getting into some of those observations that he had, but that's why I recommend this book so highly, Stages on Life's Way, if you want to see all of his insights into what true love is and how rare it is. We've already touched on that. And then when we get into the ethical sphere, in the commentary by Judge William, we'll see how in the religious sphere it's necessary to sanctify that relationship through a God relationship. So he goes on to say, but it does not please me, for I don't understand a word of it, but find that it contains a double contradiction. First, because it ends with the inexplicable, and second, because it ends there. For he who would end with the inexplicable had best begin with it and say not a word more, so as not to become an object of suspicion. We have this wonderful, a humorous style of SK in explaining this inexplicable mystery that the young man faces. And the young man is patterned after SK himself, as Walter Lowry points out way back in his youth when he was in his 20s and he fell in love with Regina. In his highly reflective mind, in the words of the young man, he was trying to understand this particular thing of being in love with this one person and no one else. And that's why a mate in life is truly a God-given thing. And people have lost this primary insight to a large extent, I think, in our time in the 21st century. He complains, who would not be alarmed if all around one people were suddenly falling down and dying, while no one was able to account for it? But this is precisely the way love pounces down in the midst of life. Only no one is alarmed by it, since the lovers regard it as the greatest happiness, but rather one is prompted to laugh, for there is a correspondence between the comic and the tragic. He remarks upon this profound mystery of falling in love and how one might meet several hundreds of women, and yet out of nowhere he suddenly meets the one. There is no real reason that anyone can think of. There is no antecedent criterion that one can name. There is no physical characteristic to which it can be attributed. Since love is the inexplicable, it doesn't make any sense to fall in love with a princess than it is to fall in love with a servant girl. So he concludes, the young man concludes his speech in this way. Behold, for these reasons I have renounced love, for to me my thought is all in all. If love be the most blissful pleasure, then I renounce the pleasure without wishing to offend anyone or to envy him. If love constitutes the condition for performing the greatest benefaction, then I disavow all claim to such an opportunity, but my thought is safely preserved. And therefore, the young man ends his speech. Now, here's where Constantine Constantius picks up, and as I've mentioned before in our earlier studies, Constantine Constantius is the alter ego of Soren Kierkegaard. It represents the more reflective side of Kierkegaard's complex personality, whereas the youth represents more the emotional side to SK, and the youthful side, whereas Constantine Constantius represents worldly shrewdness, and he looks more at marriage from a worldly point of view. Constantine Constantius begins his speech this way. There is a time to keep silence and a time to speak, and now it seems to me is a time to speak briefly, for our young friend has spoken very long and very strangely. His vis comica, comical view, has brought us to pass of fighting a doubtful battle. Ancipite pro Elio, Latin. Once again, my Latin is not too good, but only got through the first year of Latin. So, but I get by with some computer programs pretty well. And there's a lot of resources on the internet to help you in learning Latin, which I wish I had when I was taking it at the University of Colorado in the graduate school. It was a intense Latin class. We went through 1 year of Latin in 6 weeks. It was very intense, and many people think that's the way to learn a language. And I personally don't. I think you have to absorb a language. And I wish I had had more time to absorb and not just try to crush everything into my head. But I did learn some, and it's helped me quite a bit. It really is a wonderful language. But okay, I digress there. Now, I'm absolutely certain that the speech that Constantine Constantius gives is more or less the view of a male chauvinist pig, you might call him. But once again, these aren't necessarily SK's views. Parts of them are, lots of them aren't. He mixes it all together like any great novelist would. So Constantine Constantius begins with the comparison of her nature with man's nature, because Constantine Constantius always judges women in terms of what a man is. Constantine Constantius is a highly reflective individual. In general, reflection is more a male attribute than a female attribute, although of course there are many exceptions to this. All you have to do is watch the Fox News Network and all the incredibly intelligent women on the Fox News Network. But in general, men tend to have stronger powers of reflection than women, although women have far stronger powers of intuition. And in marriage, it works out perfectly. You have the reflective nature of man and the intuitive power of women. As a highly reflective male, Constantine Constantius analyzed woman as a counterpart to man. And now for woman, the subject on which I would speak. I too have pondered, and I have fathomed her category. I have sought, but I have also found, making a peerless discovery that I impart to you herewith. She can only be rightly construed under the category of just. I can see women out there just rolling their eyes. It is man's part to be absolute, to act absolutely, to give expression to the absolute. Woman has her being in relationships. Between two such different beings, no genuine reciprocal action can take place. This incongruity is precisely what constitutes just, and it is with woman that just first came into the world. And I'm not sure who he's referring to. Probably characters in Greek plays. I'm not Greek comedies. I really am not sure what character that SK is thinking about there, but or I should say Constantine Constantius is thinking about. She has the prescriptive right to be transformed in less than 24 hours into the most innocent and pardonable Gallimimus. Gallimimus is confusion, essentially. Far be it from her candid soul to want to deceive anyone. She meant all she said. Now she says the contrary, but with the same lovable frankness, for she is ready to die for the contrary. In case a man in all seriousness surrenders himself to love, he can say that he has lots of assurances if only he can get any assurance company to take the risk. For a material so inflammable as woman must always make the insurer suspicious of her continuity, essentially. Then he goes on to add these observations about the reflective powers of woman in general. She does not possess sufficient power of reflection to insure her against self-contradiction for any considerable time, say a week at the maximum, if the male does not help her regularly by contradicting her. For she forgets again as soon as she talks. So, this is a really condescending view of what women are all about. And I'm absolutely certain that a woman could write the same sort of humorous observations about men and what they're all about. That would be funny, and I'm sure it's been done by some woman author somewhere. None come to mind for me right off the top of my head. Maybe some of the characters in Shakespeare's plays, maybe. But anyway, to be a woman is something so strange, so mixed, so complex that no predicate expresses it. And the many predicates one might use contradict one another so sharply that only a woman can endure it, and still worse can enjoy it. The fact that she actually has less significance than man is not what constitutes her misfortune, even if she were to come to know it. For after all, this is something that can be endured. No, the misfortune is that owing to the romantic way in which she is regarded, her life has become meaningless, so that one moment she has the utmost significance, and the next moment none whatsoever. So here you go. This is what I would call checking my time here. It looks like we got about a minute. So here we have this male chauvinist pig analyzing the nature of woman from a highly cynical, reflective thinker. Poetry, from the drinking song to the tragedy, is the deification of woman. And here he goes into how women really inspire man to write poetry and to become great thinkers and writers. And she has this ideality in her that inspires the male creation or recreation of her in poetry, in sculpture. And it's a wonderful tribute, even in the mouth of Constantine Constantius, to what women are all about. Okay, this is going to conclude this study. We'll start up with Victor Eremita in the next lesson. Hopefully I'll have that done tomorrow. Goodbye.